The Philippines, September 1945. The war had ended, but for hundreds of Japanese women held in makeshift prisoner camps, freedom felt like just another word they couldn't trust. What happened inside one medical tent would challenge everything they believed about their captors and remind them of something they thought they'd lost forever: their humanity. Sergeant James Morrison stood outside the medical tent, clipboard trembling in his hands. At 22, he'd seen combat, watched friends die, but nothing prepared him for this assignment. Inside waited 43 Japanese women prisoners, many sick, all terrified. Dr. Samuel Hayes had been clear. They needed immediate medical inspection. Typhoid was spreading. Infected wounds were turning gangrenous. Without examination, women would die. But Morrison knew what these women had endured. He'd read the intelligence reports. He knew what Japanese imperial troops had done to their own female auxiliaries when retreat became chaos. He knew about the assaults, the brutality, the violations that happened when war stripped away the last threads of civilization. He pushed open the tent flap. 43 pairs of eyes locked onto him. Fear, raw, animal fear. Some women instinctively backed against the canvas walls. Others clutched each other. A young girl, maybe 19, started shaking uncontrollably. Morrison felt sick. This wasn't combat. This was something worse. He saw Haruka Nakamura standing at the front, her nurse's training keeping her spine straight, even as her fists clenched white. She'd been translating for the Americans, her English precise but cold. Now she stared at him with an expression that cut deeper than any enemy fire. Resignation. She expected the worst. They all did. Morrison cleared his throat. His voice came out rougher than intended. "Ladies, I need you to remove your pants for medical examination." The translation hadn't even finished before the tent erupted. Women started crying. Some dropped to their knees. Yuki Yamamoto, the youngest, collapsed entirely, hyperventilating. Fumiko Yoshida, the eldest, stepped forward, arms spread protectively in front of the younger women, ready to sacrifice herself first. Haruka's face had gone completely blank, that terrible emptiness of someone preparing for violation. Morrison saw it all and felt his stomach turn. These women thought he was going to assault them. They thought this was the beginning of mass rape. They'd been conditioned to expect it because that's what had happened before, under their own military's watch. Dr. Hayes appeared beside Morrison, sensing the crisis. The doctor's face was grim. He'd treated enough trauma victims to recognize what was happening. He spoke quietly to Morrison, but loud enough for Haruka to hear. "Sergeant, turn around, face the tent wall, that's an order." Morrison blinked, confused for a heartbeat, then understood. He turned his back to the women. Dr. Hayes did the same. Then Hayes called for Nurse Helen Parker, who'd been waiting outside. Helen entered, assessed the situation instantly, and began speaking in calm, measured tones. Haruka translated, her voice shaking. "The American doctor says they will not look. They will face away. The American nurse and I will conduct the examinations. They want only to check for disease and infection. They will not touch you. They will not see you." Silence. 43 women trying to process information that contradicted everything they'd learned to expect. Fumiko spoke first, her voice cracking. Why would they look away? Haruka had no answer. Neither did Helen. It was simply what was happening. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the women began to comply. Morrison stood facing the canvas wall, hearing fabric rustle, hearing quiet sobs, hearing whispered prayers in Japanese. His back felt exposed, vulnerable. Any of these women could have a hidden weapon. Command had warned him never to turn his back on enemy prisoners, but he understood something his training manuals hadn't taught him. Sometimes trust had to be offered first, even when it wasn't deserved, even when it was dangerous. Behind him, Helen and Haruka moved through the rows of women. What they found was worse than expected. Infected wounds left untreated for weeks. Malnutrition so severe bones showed through skin. Evidence of old trauma, physical and psychological. Helen worked with clinical efficiency, but Morrison could hear the catch in her voice when she gave instructions. Haruka translated mechanically, her professional nurse training taking over, but Morrison heard her breath hitch when she examined Yuki. The young girl had scars. Too many scars. The kind that told stories no one should have to live through. 20 minutes felt like hours. Finally, Helen spoke. "You can turn around now, Sergeant." Morrison turned. The women were dressed again, but something had changed. The fear was still there, but it had shifted. Confusion now mixed with it. Fumiko was staring at Morrison like he was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Yuki had stopped shaking. Haruka's blank expression had cracked, showing something underneath. Tentative, fragile, but unmistakably present. Hope. Dr. Hayes began explaining treatment plans through Haruka. Antibiotics for infections, nutritional supplements, clean bandages, basic dignity in medical care. The women listened in stunned silence. This wasn't how captors treated prisoners. This wasn't how men treated women they had power over. This was something else entirely. Over the following days, the medical treatment continued. Each time, Morrison and Dr. Hayes turned their backs. Each time, Helen and Haruka conducted examinations with respect and care. Word spread through the camp. Other prisoners heard about the Americans who looked away. It became a story they told each other, a small light in the darkness of captivity. Captain William Bradford initially questioned Morrison's methods. "Sergeant, you're violating basic security protocols. You don't turn your back on enemy combatants." Morrison stood his ground. "With respect, sir, they're not combatants. They're sick women who've been through hell. If we treat them like animals, we become what they expect us to be." Bradford was old-school military, a man who'd fought through the Pacific Campaign and seen Japanese forces commit atrocities. His instinct was to maintain strict, impersonal control, but he couldn't argue with results. The medical inspections were proceeding smoothly. Cooperation was increasing. The typhoid outbreak was being contained. More importantly, something intangible was changing in the camp atmosphere. The prisoners were beginning to see their captors as human beings capable of decency, and the American personnel were beginning to see the prisoners not as faceless enemies, but as individuals with stories, suffering, and dignity worth preserving. Haruka found herself in an unexpected position. As the primary translator and now assistant to Nurse Helen, she'd become a bridge between two worlds. Her own trauma was still fresh. She remembered the chaos of the Japanese retreat, the breakdown of military discipline, the night when officers who were supposed to protect their personnel instead became predators. She remembered hiding, remembered the screams of women who couldn't hide fast enough. When American forces captured her unit, she'd expected the same treatment. Every military in the world did the same things when they won, didn't they? Men with power took what they wanted. That was the rule of war. Except these Americans kept breaking that rule. One evening, after another day of medical rounds, Haruka approached Morrison. Her English was careful, formal. "Sergeant Morrison, I must ask you something." He looked up from his paperwork. "Yes, ma'am." The respectful address still surprised her every time. "Why did you turn your back? You could have watched. You had the power. We were helpless. Why did you choose not to?" Morrison set down his pen. He'd been thinking about this question himself. "My mother's a nurse," he said finally. "She told me once that medicine only works when patients trust you, and trust only works when you prove you won't abuse power just because you can. You ladies had already been through enough. Figured you deserved at least that much respect." Haruka was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised them both. "In my diary I wrote about today. I wrote, 'They told us to undress, but they looked away.' I think this is the first time since capture that I felt like a human being instead of a thing." Morrison felt something catch in his throat. "You were always human, ma'am. Always." Haruka's eyes glistened. "We forgot. After everything that happened, we forgot. You reminded us." She bowed formally, a gesture of deep respect, and left. Morrison sat alone with her words, understanding for the first time the full weight of what that simple act of turning around had meant. The transformation wasn't universal or perfect. Some prisoners remained deeply traumatized, unable to trust any man in uniform regardless of his actions. Yuki barely spoke for weeks, her trauma too deep for quick healing. Some American soldiers resented what they saw as Morrison coddling the enemy. They'd lost friends to Japanese forces. They'd seen the aftermath of atrocities. Showing respect to Japanese prisoners felt like betrayal to fallen comrades. The tension in the camp ran both ways. But slowly, incrementally, something shifted. When Dr. Hayes treated a prisoner's infected leg wound, saving her from amputation, she thanked him in broken English. When Fumiko organized the women to help clean the medical tent, Captain Bradford nodded approval and arranged for better supplies. Small acts of humanity, repeated daily, began to rebuild what war had demolished. Morrison noticed Haruka spending extra time with Yuki, speaking softly in Japanese, holding the young woman's hand during examinations. Helen explained that Haruka was using her nursing training to provide trauma counseling, helping Yuki process what had happened to her. "She's good at it," Helen observed. "She understands what Yuki's going through because she lived it too. That kind of peer support is more effective than anything I could do." Morrison watched Haruka work and felt profound respect. She'd been victimized, traumatized, imprisoned, yet she was using her pain to help others heal. That took a kind of courage he wasn't sure he possessed. One afternoon, a commotion erupted in the camp. A prisoner had collapsed during work detail. Dr. Hayes rushed to help, but the woman's friends formed a protective circle, blocking him. They were shouting in Japanese, panicked and defensive. Morrison arrived to find a standoff. Hayes was trying to explain he was a doctor, but the women wouldn't let him near. Then Haruka pushed through the crowd. She assessed the collapsed woman quickly, recognized heatstroke, and started giving orders. The prisoners obeyed immediately. Haruka looked up at Hayes. "She needs intravenous fluids, fast." Hayes nodded, but the women still wouldn't let him close. Haruka made a decision. "Doctor, tell me what to do, I'll do it, they trust me." For the next 20 minutes, Haruka administered emergency medical care under Hayes's verbal instruction. Her hands were steady, her focus absolute. She'd been trained for this, but training was different from doing it alone with a life hanging in the balance. When the woman's breathing stabilized and color returned to her face, a collective exhale of relief swept through the watching prisoners. Hayes looked at Haruka with open admiration. "You just saved her life. That was excellent work, Nurse Nakamura." The formal acknowledgement of her professional title, the respect in his voice, it meant everything. Haruka bowed. "Thank you for trusting me, Doctor." Hayes smiled. "You earned that trust." Captain Bradford witnessed the incident and called Morrison to his office afterward. "Sergeant, I owe you an apology. I thought your methods were soft, potentially dangerous. I was wrong. What you started with that first medical inspection, it's created something valuable here. These prisoners are cooperating, helping us maintain order, even providing medical assistance now. That doesn't happen in most POW camps. That happens because you treated them like human beings first." Morrison didn't know what to say. Bradford continued. "I'm recommending you for commendation. More importantly, I'm implementing your approach camp-wide. Respect first, force only when absolutely necessary. It's working." The news spread through the American personnel. Reactions were mixed. Some soldiers embraced the approach, finding it easier to treat prisoners humanely when given permission and structure to do so. Others remained hostile, viewing any kindness to the enemy as weakness. Morrison found himself in arguments in the mess tent, defending his methods against accusations of being soft on Japan. "They're not Japan," he'd argue back. "They're people who happened to be born there, who got caught up in a war they didn't start, and who've suffered just like our people suffered. Treating them with basic decency doesn't dishonor our dead. It honors what our dead were fighting for." The arguments never fully resolved, but they happened, and that was something. Weeks passed. The medical crisis stabilized. Infections cleared. Nutrition improved. The camp settled into routine. But the moment of that first inspection, when Morrison and Hayes turned their backs, remained a touchstone. Prisoners referenced it in conversations. Remember when they looked away? It became shorthand for a larger truth. Even in the darkest circumstances, even between enemies, humanity could survive if someone was brave enough to offer it first. Haruka wrote about it extensively in her diary, entries that would later be preserved and studied by historians trying to understand the complex aftermath of the Pacific War. One evening, Fumiko approached Morrison with a request. Through Haruka's translation, she explained that the prisoners wanted to hold a memorial service for women who died before reaching the camp. They wanted to honor their dead with dignity. Morrison brought the request to Bradford, expecting resistance. Instead, Bradford approved immediately. "They're entitled to mourn their dead, Sergeant. Arrange it." The service was simple but profound. The women gathered in a cleared space, sang traditional songs, said prayers, wept openly. American personnel watched from a respectful distance. When it ended, Fumiko approached Bradford directly. Her English was limited, but her meaning was clear. "Thank you. You give us honor. We not forget." Bradford, The hardened veteran who'd fought across the Pacific nodded with visible emotion. Honor should never be taken from anyone, ma'am, not even in war. The camp operated for 3 more months before prisoners were processed for repatriation to Japan. During that time, the relationships forged in crisis deepened. Helen trained Haruka in advanced nursing techniques. Dr. Hayes wrote a letter of recommendation for Haruka to use when seeking medical employment in post-war Japan. Morrison helped several prisoners write letters to families navigating the complex military mail system. These were small acts, but they mattered. They represented the possibility of rebuilding humanity after it had been systematically dismantled by war. On the day of departure, the prisoners lined up for final processing. Haruka found Morrison one last time. She handed him a folded piece of paper. "My diary entry. From the first day. I want you to have it." Morrison unfolded the paper carefully. The Japanese characters meant nothing to him, but Haruka had written an English translation below. September 15th, 1945. They told us to undress, but they looked away. I did not understand. Enemy soldiers do not show mercy. Enemy soldiers do not grant dignity. But these men turned their backs and gave us privacy in our most vulnerable moment. I do not know what this means for the future, but today, for the first time since the war began, I felt human again. Perhaps there is hope after all. Morrison looked up, words failing him. Haruka smiled, a real smile, the first he'd ever seen from her. "You gave us hope, Sergeant Morrison. You and Dr. Hayes and Nurse Parker and even Captain Bradford. You showed us that not all men abuse power when they have it. You showed us that enemies can still treat each other with dignity. That lesson will stay with us forever. We will tell our children and grandchildren about the Americans who looked away." She bowed deeply, then turned and walked toward the transport trucks. Morrison watched her go, the diary page still in his hand, understanding that what had happened in this camp was both extraordinary and simple. People choosing to be decent when they could have been cruel. Years later, historians would study the camp records and interview survivors. They'd find that the mortality rate in this particular facility was significantly lower than comparable POW camps. They'd find that instances of violence, both prisoner on prisoner and guard on prisoner, were remarkably rare. They'd find testimony after testimony referencing that first medical inspection, when American personnel turned their backs. Psychologists would analyze it as a critical moment of trust building. Military analysts would study it as an effective pacification technique. But for the people who were there, it was simpler than that. It was the moment when someone chose dignity over domination, respect over exploitation, humanity over hatred. It was the moment when Sergeant James Morrison, barely out of boyhood himself, decided that the women in his care deserved to be treated as human beings, and in making that choice, reminded everyone involved of their own humanity. The war had taken so much from everyone. It had destroyed cities, shattered families, traumatized generations. It had shown humanity at its absolute worst. But in a medical tent in the Philippines, in September 1945, something different happened. A young sergeant turned his back. A doctor followed his lead. A nurse provided care with compassion. And 43 women who had every reason to expect cruelty found dignity instead. It wasn't enough to erase the horrors they'd endured. It wasn't enough to heal all wounds or right all wrongs. But it was enough to prove that even in war's aftermath, even between enemies, decency could survive. That simple act of looking away, of granting privacy and respect when power would have allowed violation, became a story worth remembering, because it showed what humanity could be, even at its lowest point. It showed that we always have a choice. We can abuse power, or we can restrain it. We can dehumanize others, or we can recognize their humanity. We can perpetuate cycles of cruelty, or we can break them. Morrison, Hayes, Helen, and eventually Bradford made their choice. And in doing so, they gave 43 women something more valuable than medical treatment. They gave them back their sense of self-worth. Haruka Nakamura returned to Japan and worked as a nurse for 40 years. She never forgot the Americans who turned their backs. She told the story to her children, who told it to theirs. In her 80s, she was interviewed by a documentary filmmaker researching post-war reconciliation. When asked what moment defined her experience as a prisoner of war, she didn't hesitate. "When they told us to remove our pants for medical examination, I was certain we would be violated. We all were. We had learned to expect it. But the American sergeant and doctor turned around. They faced the wall. They gave us privacy. In that moment, I understood that not all men are the same. Not all soldiers are the same. That one act of respect changed everything for me. It gave me hope that the world could be better than what the war had shown us. Sergeant James Morrison returned to the United States and became a teacher. He rarely spoke about his war service, but he kept Haruka's diary page in a frame on his desk. When students asked about it, he'd tell them the story, not as a tale of American heroism, but as a lesson about the power of small choices. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," he'd say. "I just turned around." But sometimes that's all it takes. One small act of decency when cruelty would be easier. That's how you change the world, one moment at a time. His students would carry that lesson forward, applying it in their own lives, creating ripples from that original moment of compassion. Dr. Samuel Hayes continued his military medical career and later worked with the Veterans Administration, specializing in trauma treatment. His experience in the Philippines camp shaped his approach to patient care. He understood that healing required more than physical treatment. It required dignity, respect, and the recognition of shared humanity. He trained generations of doctors in this philosophy, and his influence spread through the medical community. The simple act of turning his back in that tent became a teaching moment he referenced throughout his career. Sometimes the most powerful medical intervention is respecting a patient's vulnerability. Nurse Helen Parker wrote extensively about her experiences, contributing to the emerging field of trauma-informed care. Her articles emphasize the importance of cultural sensitivity, gender-appropriate medical treatment, and the psychological dimensions of physical healing. She argued that the success of the Philippines camp medical program wasn't due to superior resources or techniques, but to the fundamental decision to treat prisoners as human beings deserving of dignity. Her work influenced military medical protocols and civilian nursing education for decades. Captain William Bradford retired as a colonel, his views on prisoner treatment permanently altered by what he witnessed in the Philippines. He became an advocate for humane treatment of detainees, arguing that respect and dignity were not weaknesses, but strategic strengths. He testified before military committees about the effectiveness of dignity-based approaches to prisoner management. His report cited lower violence rates, higher cooperation levels, and better post-war reconciliation outcomes. The data supported what his heart had learned. Treating people humanely wasn't just morally right, it was practically effective. Yuki Yamamoto, the youngest prisoner, struggled for years with her trauma. But with Haruka's support and the foundation of trust established in that camp, she slowly rebuilt her life. She became a teacher in a rural Japanese village, dedicating herself to educating children about peace and the true costs of war. She never spoke publicly about her experiences, but those close to her knew that she carried both deep scars and profound gratitude. The Americans who looked away hadn't erased her trauma, but they'd shown her that not all men were monsters. That knowledge, however painful the journey to it had been, allowed her to trust again, to love again, to live again. Fumiko Yoshida returned to her family in Osaka and lived to be 93 years old. She became a community elder, respected for her wisdom and compassion. When asked about surviving the war, she'd speak about the importance of maintaining dignity in impossible circumstances. "We were prisoners, defeated, sick, terrified," she'd say. "We had every reason to give up hope. But then something unexpected happened. Our captors showed us respect. They could have humiliated us, violated us, treated us as less than human. Instead, they turned their backs and gave us privacy. That taught me that humanity persists even in the darkest times. You just have to look for it, and sometimes you have to be brave enough to offer it first." The story of the medical tent spread beyond the individuals involved. It became part of the larger narrative of post-war reconciliation between Japan and the United States. Historians noted that camps where prisoners were treated with dignity produced fewer long-term psychological casualties and better post-war attitudes toward former enemies. The Philippines camp became a case study in effective humanitarian treatment of prisoners. Military academies studied it. International humanitarian organizations referenced it. The simple act of turning around became a symbol of what was possible when people chose compassion over cruelty. But perhaps the most important legacy was the quietest one. The children and grandchildren of those 43 women grew up hearing the story. They learned that their mothers and grandmothers had been treated with unexpected dignity by former enemies. This knowledge shaped their views of Americans, of war, of humanity itself. When they encountered Americans in business, education, or tourism, they remembered the story of the soldiers who looked away. It created a foundation of goodwill that transcended political tensions and historical grievances. One moment of respect, multiplied across generations, became a bridge between cultures. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a group of survivors from the camp traveled to the United States. They met with Morrison, now elderly, but still sharp. They met with Hayes's children, as the doctor had passed away. They met with Helen, who was in her 80s but still vibrant. The reunion was emotional, filled with tears and laughter and memories. Haruka, now 78, stood before the small group and spoke. "We came here to say thank you, not just for medical treatment, not just for keeping us alive, but for reminding us that we were human beings worthy of respect. You gave us that gift when you turned your backs in the medical tent. You trusted us when you had no reason to. You showed us dignity when we expected cruelty. That changed our lives. It changed how we raised our children. It changed how we see the world. So thank you. Thank you for choosing compassion when hatred would have been easier." Morrison, now 72, responded with characteristic humility. "We just did what was right, what anyone should do. You were sick, scared, and far from home. We had the power to make your situation worse or better. We chose better. That's not heroism, that's just basic decency." But Haruka shook her head. "In war, basic decency becomes extraordinary. You made a choice that many others would not have made. You saw us as human beings when it would have been easier to see us as enemies. That choice mattered. It still matters. It will always matter." The reunion was covered by several news outlets, reigniting interest in the story. Young people on both sides of the Pacific learned about the medical tent in the Philippines. The story was shared on early internet forums, in school projects, and family conversations. It became a touchstone for discussions about how enemies can find common humanity, how small acts of kindness can have lasting impact, how dignity and respect cost nothing but mean everything. In an era of increasing globalization, the story offered a powerful lesson. We are all human first and everything else second. Morrison died in 2003 at the age of 80. His obituary mentioned his teaching career, his family, and his service in World War II. But those who knew him best remembered him for the story of the medical tent. At his funeral, his daughter read from Haruka's diary entry, the one he'd kept framed on his desk for 58 years. "They told us to undress, but they looked away." Those simple words captured a moment of profound humanity, a choice to respect rather than exploit, to dignify rather than dehumanize. It was the defining moment of Morrison's life, not because it was dramatic or heroic in the traditional sense, but because it was decent. And in a world that had just experienced the most destructive war in human history, decency was the most radical act imaginable. Haruka outlived Morrison by a decade. She died in 2013 at the age of 91. Her children found dozens of diaries she'd kept throughout her life, but the entry from September 15, 1945, remained the most significant. It had been copied, translated, studied, and shared countless times. It stood as testament to the power of a single moment of respect. In her final years, Haruka often said that she'd lived a good life, full of love and purpose, but that she never forgot what it felt like to be treated as less than human, and then, unexpectedly, to be shown dignity. "That contrast taught me everything I needed to know about how to live," she'd say. "Choose dignity. Always choose dignity. For yourself and for others. That's the lesson I learned in a medical tent in the Philippines, and it's the lesson I've tried to live by ever since. The medical tent is long gone. The camp was dismantled decades ago. The physical evidence of what happened there has vanished. But the story persists. It's told in classrooms and living rooms, in documentaries and books, in conversations between strangers who discover a shared interest in history. It persists because it offers something rare and precious, proof that even in humanity's darkest moments, light can break through. It persists because it shows that we always have a choice. We can abuse power or restrain it. We can dehumanize or dignify. We can perpetuate cruelty or break the cycle. Sergeant James Morrison, Dr. Samuel Hayes, Nurse Helen Parker, and eventually Captain William Bradford made their choice. They turned their backs. They looked away. And in doing so, they gave 43 women something more valuable than medical treatment. They gave them back their humanity. And that gift, once given, echoed across decades, across generations, across the vast distance between former enemies who became, in one small moment of grace, simply human beings treating each other with the respect everyone deserves. If you enjoyed this story of unexpected humanity in the darkest of times, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. History is full of these powerful moments where individuals chose compassion over cruelty. What other stories should we explore? Let us know.